The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello, and welcome back to the Storyology podcast, where I, material scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Pajajski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and storytelling. We're currently at the stage of science communication where the science gets published. We've heard about how this system works and the many problems with it, which all seem to stem from the massive competition between researchers. Last episode, we heard that storytelling is an integral part of how scientific research gets published. We heard that in crafting these stories, researchers might strip out lots of details that actually impede the flow of the narrative. These might be failures or dead ends, or they may be truths about the real expectations or questions that they were asking at the start of the work, which turned out to be wrong. Most importantly, publishers know that all of this is going on in the author's head as they are turning their work into a publication. In fact, the publishers themselves encourage storytelling, and the editors act as sort of co-narrators to help the scientists tell the best version of the story that they can, while still maintaining some sort of rigour. So what can we take from all this? Well, that scientists are definitely operating within a flawed system in which story plays an integral part. And to tell that story, that involves stripping out a lot of detail about what really happened. And that part is really important to remember for this episode that you're about to hear, which is all about one potential solution to the problems with publishing, in a concept called open research. To take us through this, we'll hear from a new expert.
So my name's Sarah Callaghan, and I work for the University of Oxford as the Research Practice Manager. And what Research Practice Manager means is Oxford University, or the University of Oxford, has a lot of researchers that are doing research, and the Research Practice Manager is help them to do research better, where better means more open, more transparent, more reliable, more verifiable, more ethical, all those really important things.
As well as two researchers that you've heard before.
Pen-Yuan Hsing
and Dr. Jess.
Let's start by hearing a definition of open research from Sarah.
So historically speaking, there were an awful lot of people who called themselves alchemists, who were doing lots of scientific research, and they were discovering lots and lots of things, but they never actually shared them with anybody else. So they had written them down in their secret little notebooks with their secret little codes. So there was all this discovery about the nature of chemistry that was being done that was not making its way into the wider body of scholarly knowledge, because the alchemists were going, oh no, this will turn my lead into gold. I don't want to share it with anybody. It's only when people who were doing chemical research or alchemical research started talking to each other and started sharing the results that the field of chemistry actually started becoming a viable, useful thing, where the knowledge was, where it was possible to use the knowledge that had been discovered to make people's lives better from a variety of points of view. But also it was able to build on the stuff that other people had done, so you weren't reinventing the wheel. So you didn't have everybody starting off from first principles and distilling phosphorus out of lots and lots of wee, or whatever, how they go about doing that. I trained as a physicist, not as a chemist. So, but basically with open research, I think we're doing a kind of phase change, a step change in a very similar way to the step change between alchemy going to chemistry, because at the moment, or over the past decades, even like a couple of centuries, the knowledge that has been created as part of academic research has been kept within the academic research bubble. And occasionally some of it has kind of escaped out to become things that are developed into real world things. But for the most part, the research that has been done just stays in that academic research bubble. Open research and open scholarship is an attempt to not so much repackage, but reconceptualize the research that's been done in academia with the point of view of making it understandable and reusable to not only other academics, but also to people in the wider world, whether they're people who are looking to develop the next new invention or drugs or whatever, or technologies, but also to members of the general public as well, who also have an interest in that. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is that an awful lot of research is funded by public money. So the taxpayers pay for it fundamentally, and it would be a good thing for them to at least have the ability to go and find out what they've actually been paying for. Now, this is not an easy problem to solve, but it's kind of what we're trying to move away or move into. And of course, there's always situations where you don't want everything to be open because it could, I mean, I don't want my personal health records to be open to everybody, thank you very much. And we don't want the endangered animals locations being kind of broadcast everywhere because they'll get nobbled by poachers or whatever. So it's that sort of thing. There's a lot of reasons why not to make everything open, but they're the exceptions rather than the rule.
I asked Pen how long open research has been around for.
I think it certainly has become much more of a thing in the past decade or so. And I certainly know that a specific component of it, which is the advocacy to publish open source software that underlines your research, it was informed not just by the open source software movement, which started about 25, almost 30 years ago now, but also it goes back further still to the 1980s when people started to advocate for the fact that for any piece of software or actually just technology that you're using, it is important for you to have that freedom to use it, study it, change it, and continue to share it without restrictions, because otherwise you're letting your agency being taken away by whoever originated that technology in the first place. And I think this really informs open research in general, because knowledge is power. So if the people imparting that knowledge on you or allowing you to access research has all the power to restrict what you do with it, then it's taking away some of our agency when it comes to how we make use of research.
This all sounds pretty great. I mean, who can argue with knowledge is power? And it sounds like it might definitely go some way to dismantling this damaging competition aspect of scientific publishing. But I wondered, what does open research actually look like in practice?
I mean, this is the point where if I had slides, I'd have my cake illustration. So my cake analogy. So first of all, the first picture is a bunch of cake ingredients. So you've got your flour, you've got your eggs, you've got your margarine, sugar, and they're all in separate bowls and whatever. And they're the data. They're the stuff that you collect. And then you do a load of processing on it and you kind of bake yourself a cake, right? And that is the information. So it's been processed, it's been understood, it's been put into a certain amount of context. Right. This is a plain cake, nothing fancy, no frosting, no anything like that. No icing. Then if you want to, so you can eat that cake without any problems. I mean, it's a perfectly good cake, but it might not appeal to members of the general public because it's a standard like Victoria sponge with nothing fancy on it. Whereas if you add the layer of icing over the top, which is, I tend to consider that as kind of metadata, so information about the cake, you're adding this kind of nice, tasty layer of extra information that's context, but it can also be stuff that is visually appealing or analytically appealing. And then, of course, after you've eaten up the cake, you have learned something new and exciting. The difference between data and cake is that you can consume data or you can use data and it's not actually consumed. So it's not actually used up by the process of being used. You can use data many, many, many times and information the same way. So by that kind of analogy, where you kind of want to think about the research output, which is what you want to produce at the end of your research project. But you got to think about what you want that to be, what kind of shape you want it to look like, whether that's a journal article or as we're trying to encourage more people to do, it's more than just a journal article. So the journal article is kind of like the top layer of royal icing on the top of the cake. It's the stuff that the people see first, and then oftentimes will just kind of, they won't get any further than the journal article. But then there's the whole kind of extra bits of the cake underneath it, which is the data, the code, the methodologies, how they were created, the protocols, the extra context that doesn't come into the journal article because it's either very specific or it's just not of interest to the journals, and that can be stuff like so say for example you're running an experiment where you're doing observational measurements of how much rain is happening. You might have metadata where it goes that my rain gauge stopped recording because somebody tipped a bucket of water into it, or somebody streamed the power cable to it. So that's important stuff for people to know, but not necessarily kind of journal paper worthy.
Feeling hungry yet? I know I am. But my main thought about this is that this metadata stuff makes the research a much more interesting story, because this metadata tells about the experience of the people involved, about the flaws and the mistakes that make it a much more human description about what really happened. And of course, not everybody is going to find that stuff interesting. I guess whereas traditional science publishing tells a very narrow version of the story that happened to a very narrow audience, open research seems to promise different stories to different audiences.
I think different people will require different stories to be told about the same output, depending on what it is they want to know and what it is they want to learn. So I can imagine a situation of you have a research output where you have, say, somebody who's working in the same field wants to know, okay, you ran these experiments with these protocols and you got these results. Great, that's what I'm interested in. Whereas you might have another researcher who goes, oh, I tried running that experiment in that particular way and I got different results. What did you do that was different? What were the changes? How come we don't agree? And that involves getting potentially into the nitty-gritty weeds of the really specific metadata type stuff. So I think, not all stories are interesting to all people. So it's the same with research. You got to think about who your audience is when you start crafting your stories about your research, and that's perfectly fine. We've been doing this for a long time, and we understand this. Fundamentally, it's about you have the simple story on the top, and people can just eat the icing off the top of the cake. They don't have to eat the rest of the cake. They just eat the icing off the top, and that is perfectly fine. But if somebody wants to dig into the detail, then that detail is there, because historically speaking, when the journal articles have been published, they've not provided any of the other information supporting it. So effectively, you're getting a very thin layer of icing, or you're getting a layer of icing on top of a very thin layer of cake, if that's the analogy. Whereas now we're encouraging researchers to make their cakes thicker, so have more data there, more information in that people can consume if they want, but they don't have to.
But telling multiple stories about the same science to multiple audiences sounds like much more work and effort on account of the researchers. And I wondered, how does the research community feel about open research? Here's Pen.
I think it really depends on which subject areas that you're talking about, which epistemologies that people use when they do their research. And depending on that, you will get very different answers. What I mean is, in some subjects, let's say astrophysics, there is more of a tradition, not necessarily 100%, but more of a tradition of people working together and sharing more of what they do, sharing their data sets, such as the huge data sets that's coming out of CERN, for example, that they generate every single day, or the fact that a lot of physicists are really used to publishing preprints of their research even before it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, right? On the other hand, there might be some disciplines where people are really used to holding their cards really close to their chests. And there's a normative culture where you don't share anything or any aspect of what you're doing. And you only write just enough in your papers to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's it. And you wouldn't share anything else, right? So yeah, it goes back to my short answer. I think it really depends on discipline and how people research.
Although it does sound like a lot more effort for the researchers to tell all these different stories, actually, Sarah made the point that it could be saving everyone a lot more effort in the long run.
So we don't know what use data will be put to in the future. Right, we can't know because, we can have a good guess. We can guess that, all right, if we have two data sets that are practically the same thing, the data set that will be used in the future is the one that's accurately described and has more information about it, and it makes it easier for people to use rather than the data set that's just the data, right? So you have to make data sets usable for them to be reused in the future. If they're not usable, it's not worth keeping. But again, another story that I have about collecting data and why it's important to save data and record it for the long term. So back in the 16th and 17th centuries, there were a load of seafaring captains and ships traveling around the world. And every day the captains would make meteorological measurements and record them in the ship's logs. They were making those measurements as a matter of kind of course or a matter of habit. They, at the time they were taking those measurements, they had absolutely no idea that those measurements would then be used several hundred years later as ground truth for historic climate models. Right. So that is kind of like, so we can be collecting data now and we can be using it for one purpose, and then there is a distinct possibility, it might only be a small possibility, but there's a distinct possibility that the data that we're collecting now could be vitally useful for something that we haven't even thought about yet.
So clearly, in principle, open research has a lot to offer. But as flawed as the current, more closed version of publishing is, I can see that this traditional way has some merits. Principally that, despite its flaws, there is credibility and integrity attached to science that is published in a respected, peer-reviewed journal. We trust that due process has been followed. I wondered how that integrity would hold up in a culture of open research, where there are risks associated with anyone being able to access any data and do whatever they want with it. Sarah had a great example of open data going awry.
So when COVID happened, all the academic publishers, first of all, made all coronavirus research open and accessible and readable by everybody. And the statistics that were being collected were of case numbers and mortality rates and stuff like that. They were being made available to basically put online for anybody to go and have a download and have a look at it. And there was an awful lot of interest in that sort of thing, which I think was really cool. Now, at the time, I was editor-in-chief of a newly launched journal of data science. So it was really interesting to see what people were doing with the coronavirus, with the COVID data sets, because we'd get a lot of people coming and writing very quick and short articles about COVID based on data that they downloaded for free from the US NIH National Institute of Health, and also NHS data and stuff like that. And these would be data scientists who literally downloaded the data, ran a few of their favorite data analysis procedures across it, and went, okay, my results show that, blah. Oftentimes the results were, some were better than others, and some people ran a kind of projection and discovered or decided that the rates of infection were exponential, and therefore they extrapolated it out to everybody in the world getting COVID within the next 3 months, which was not correct, because that's what happens when you get that's what happens sometimes when you get people who have data processing and statistical knowledge but don't have epidemiological knowledge. So that's why it's always important to have the context and have the people who understand the science or the research behind it to be able to weigh in and provide their opinions on things. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on, and it reached the point where I was seeing non-technical friends on Facebook, on my Facebook friends list, having run some of these kind of simple data analysis procedures and reporting them. And there was an awful lot of graphs running around the place, or being shared around the place as well. I had to kind of jump in and kind of tell people, no, it doesn't work like that, stop it, a few times. But there was a big interest in that sort of data and how it was presented and how people could use it.
I asked researcher Jess what she thought of open science and whether she had any thoughts or other suggestions for how to fix the science publishing industry. And turns out she had quite a lot of thoughts.
Well, this is a really interesting question. It's one that I've thought about a lot this week. I met some people from Octopus. I don't know if you've met. And that's kind of much more based on this idea of publishing almost every little aspect of what you do. So you publish the method, you publish the protocol, you publish the aims, you get critique and feedback on all of that before you write it up for your big paper. And I think that's fantastic. And in an optimized world or, utopia, you'd have something like that, because then you could cite your protocol and you wouldn't have to write that out every time that you're reusing it, or you could use that to apply for a grant, or you could get some input and feedback on whether that's a useful thing before you go about and start the actual study. But that requires like a huge shift to the way that academia is currently operating, which I'm not sure the field of science is ready for. I think that I would, well, obviously, again, utopia, move away from these short-term contracts. I think one of the huge challenges is in lots of scientific areas, people are really hesitant to preprint anything. So they're really hesitant to put, most people listening will know about the process of peer review, but once you've done that process of writing up your paper, you submit it to a journal, the journal sends it out for peer review, the reviewer's comments can take actually quite a long time to come back. Then you respond to the comments, you may have to rewrite the paper, and then you resubmit it and see what happens. And there's a movement now within science to preprint. So before that peer review process has happened, to upload it to a preprint server where you can also receive comments from the community, but it's online. You've got a kind of DOI, you've got this digital object identifier that says, I've done this science, it's time-stamped, everyone knows it's there. So even if you're worried about being scooped, everyone can see that you've got it online. But in some fields, you're not supposed to do that. And some professors get really worried about it. And it can really impact people's career. And I fully appreciate that. But I suppose I think we need more. Well, we really just need to think about it, about what's important to do in science. Is it important to have a high number of badly written, fast papers? Or is it important to really critically give people time to think, to do an experiment properly, for the experiment to go wrong? Because if the experiment goes right all the time, then your idea is boring, right? Someone's done it. So it's got to go wrong. And then give people time to properly write it up. And I think, and then either have it much, much cheaper to submit to journals, or have these kind of community-driven journals, or journals that are linked to an academic institution, or just basically not-for-profit academic publishing. That's just making huge amounts of money for shareholders and not really incentivizing science done properly. And then make the peer review process less onerous for the people doing peer review. because at the moment you rely on an awful lot of goodwill from scientists, where you kind of, write to a bunch of scientists and say, will you review this paper? And then they get, next to no credit and certainly no financial recuperation or whatever the word is. And then after that, it can take a really long time. So I think the model is fundamentally broken, and you can see it's broken because you even had editors going on strike a couple of weeks ago because they're so badly paid in these publishing houses. But I do wish that we gave more time to science done properly, and didn't, metrics that we know don't determine excellence, whether that's citation count, kind of H-index, or whether that's the impact factor of the journal that you publish in. We know that doesn't go hand in hand with doing science really properly. But until we've defined what doing science properly is, then it's really, really hard to say what is and isn't brilliant.
This then is a highly complex, imperfect and difficult to navigate system. But I want to give the last word on this publishing section of the podcast to the wonderfully inspiring and optimistic Pen.
I just want to get back to the individual. People asking, what can I do as an individual? Well, first of all, there's that part I mentioned earlier about recognizing some big problems are really hard to solve through individual action. I see so many people talking about, hey, if you want to do open research, here are the things you can do to make your research more open. That's great, but it's really hard for people to do it as individual action, right? Again, we cannot individually recycle our way out of the climate crisis, but there's still stuff that we can do. For example, we can at least recognize that there are those among us who are willing to stick their heads out, and stick their heads up and try to start enacting some of this change. And rather than, pushing them down, we can at least encourage them and recognize them to the extent that we can. And another thing is that, we are really, fundamentally born to cooperate. I'm really inspired by this concept that comes from evolutionary biology and behavioral science. That says that humans are actually born to cooperate. Our brains are structured in a way that we are actually really good at cooperating. And they call this concept the snuggle for survival. And I love this concept because it really stimulates us into thinking beyond, the religious dogma of competition in research. And we can apply that creativity into the things that we do. And two more other quick things. One is that I strongly believe that people in greater positions of power and privilege have an equally greater responsibility to start to change things. Because when they do things, it comes with slightly less risk than people who are earlier in their careers, or researchers who are minoritized, or researchers who simply have less power in some way. So if you are a relatively senior researcher, my message to you is that you have the responsibility to change things, and it is way past time that you start taking the lead to show people how we can do research in a better way. The other thing I will mention is that these systemic problems are often collective action problems, where it is very hard for one person and an individual to make a change. That will make them lose. All of us has to move together, and that's really hard. But again, there are people working on this. And one key group of people that I really want to give a shout out to are the unions. So in the UK, for academic researchers, we have the University and College Union, the UCU, and they really reminded me the importance of solidarity. We are facing so many of the same problems, but the competitive system is dividing us and atomizing us into individuals. But if we can at least support the union in the tremendous work that they're doing, then we can start to move the needle a little bit through collective bargaining. And I think, it is way past time for us to better recognize and encourage participation in the union to deal with some of the underlying problems. For example, whether you are a scientist doing neuroscience, or you are that legal scholar, or you are the medievalist, or you are the English professor, studying 17th century literature, we all have colleagues in our field who could be professors who still live in tents. And I think if we cannot even be sure of our next paycheck, then we wouldn't even have the opportunity to think about how we tell the stories of the research that we do.
So the science publishing industry isn't perfect, and nor are some of the potential solutions like open research. On the one hand, trust in experts has taken a real knock in recent years, and there's a strong argument to be made for making science as transparent and as open as possible. But on the other hand, making data accessible to everyone risks misinterpretation and important messages from experts getting lost amongst even more noise than there already is online and in the media. I think my favourite element of open research is that it encourages scientists to tell more than one story about their research. A good piece of open research would contain stories suitable for publics and end beneficiaries of the research, as well as stories for scientific experts and for the scientists' peers. It might end up being more effort for the scientists to bake all of those different layers into their cake, but thinking of those different audiences is frankly something that they should be doing anyway. After all, what's the point in baking a cake if nobody's going to eat it? You're going to eat all that by yourself, are you? Next time, we'll move further down our pipeline from science publishing to science in the media. We'll hear from some now familiar voices about stories' impact on science in the news, and we'll hear from new experts who work in this space about the role of storytelling in how science makes it into the public consciousness. This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded programme. All of the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals and don't necessarily represent those of their employers. I've been your host, Anna Pajajski, and if you want to read more about my work around story and science, head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.